Now on BBC One with John Humphrys and Moira Stewart.
Tony Blair has reshuffled his cabinet and turfed out more ministers than expected. Peter Mandelson has been given a seat, but Harriet Harman lost her job, and so did 3 others. The government's dropped the bill that would have lowered the age of consent for gay sex. The Olympics president has said not all drugs should be banned. And England have done it. Now it's 1 test apiece. Good evening. Tony Blair has been wielding his ministerial axe with more enthusiasm than had been expected. All the leaks suggested that he'd sack 3 cabinet ministers. In fact, he got rid of 4, including Harriet Harman. It had been thought she'd be demoted, but kept in the cabinet. And Peter Mandelson has been promoted, a seat at the cabinet table with his own ministry. One of the biggest winners in the reshuffle is Jack Cunningham, who, in his new role, becomes responsible for the coordination and presentation of policy. Peter Mandelson enters the cabinet the first time at Trade and Industry, though he's ditching the title President of the Board of Trade. Also new to the cabinet are Alistair Darling, who becomes the new Social Security Secretary, and Stephen Byers, who replaces him as Chief Secretary to the Treasury. The biggest losers include Harriet Harman, who lost her job at Social Security, the former Transport Minister Gavin Strang and the Public Services Minister David Clark also lost their jobs, and the Minister for Social Security Reform Frank Field resigned after failing to be promoted. Our Chief Political Correspondent John Sargent reports.
The most prominent casualty was the Social Security Secretary Harriet Harman. Tony Blair tried to soften the blow by suggesting to her that she should take a breather from frontline politics. But everyone knew she would like to have stayed, and she was left with the role of the brave loser.
I'm very proud to have helped modernise the Labour Party over the last 15 years. And I'm very proud over the last 15 months to help deliver to the heart of government policies on women and families that I've campaigned for all my political life. I'm going to fully support the government, and I haven't got anything further
And what
to
now
add.
for welfare? The surprising winner was the Agriculture Minister Jack Cunningham, who's jumped to prominence as the minister who will see that Mr Blair's writ runs through Whitehall. The most important theme of this reshuffle is a clear strengthening of the Prime Minister's power.
When I worked in the Prime Minister's office in the 70s, I actually suggested to James Callaghan then that the Prime Minister's office should be strengthened. I actually recommended that he should appoint a minister in the Prime Minister's office. I didn't realise that 20 years later I might be fulfilling a somewhat similar role for Tony Blair.
Those close to Mr Blair have been moved into key positions.
I don't know what my new post is.
Peter Mandelson has finally joined the cabinet as Trade Secretary. It's a deliberate attempt to give him a chance to shake off his reputation as a master of the black arts of political persuasion. Stephen Byers, also a close ally of Mr Blair, goes to the Treasury. Nick Brown gives up his behind-the-scenes job as Chief Whip to join the cabinet as Agriculture Minister. One of the most unexpected changes was the removal of the Leader of the House of Lords.
He said he wanted to change. I don't know what it relates to particularly. He just said he thought it was time for a change of the leadership of the House of Lords. And of course, it's entirely a matter for the Prime Minister, not a matter for me.
Lord Richard is replaced by the Health Minister, Baroness Jay. Her appointment leaves the number of women in the cabinet unchanged. She thought she might be too old.
As I said when I went in, I thought maybe they were going to say I was too old at 58.
Margaret Beckett, as Leader of the Commons, loses her policy role at the Department of Trade. But Number 10 says she and Jack Cunningham will regularly give interviews across the whole range of government policy. The only minister who resigned voluntarily today was the Minister for Welfare Reform, Frank Field, who left when he was not offered the top job in Social Security. One of Mr Blair's aims has been to stamp out suggestions that personality differences are affecting the work of the government. Mr Mandelson and the Chancellor Gordon Brown were deliberately shown this evening getting on well. If anyone had any doubts that it's Mr Blair and not the Chancellor Gordon Brown who dominates this government, those doubts are likely to have been dispelled by this reshuffle. Mr Blair has shown that when he's choosing members of the government, there's no doubt at all that he's the boss. John Sargent, BBC News, Downing Street.
2 people are feared drowned after a wartime flying boat crashed and sank off the south coast near Southampton. The Catalina had 18 passengers on board when it got into difficulties during a flight over the city.
It's believed the plane tried to land once, circled, then tried to land again, but on skimming the surface, pitched forwards into the water.
All of a sudden it just seemed to, it was doing dips on the waves, and it just seemed to plunge into the water, didn't it?
So it was obvious there was something wrong.
Straight away it was obvious there was something wrong.
I just got shocked, really. Was just open to see it sort of just land and that's it, but didn't expect to see anything like this.
It's understood 16 people were rescued, another 2 are still missing. The Catalina was full of Southampton City Council VIPs. She's here to promote the council's Sea Wings 2000 event for the millennium, designed to showcase the city's aviation and maritime history. Meanwhile, a large crane is now trying to pull the plane back out of the water. Stuart Norval, BBC News, Southampton.
It's been announced in the past hour that the government has given up trying to lower the age of consent for gay sex from 18 to 16 for this Parliament, at least. Our correspondent Christine Stewart is at Westminster. Christine, this is because the Lords threw it out last week.
Well, the government had always made it clear that it wasn't prepared to jeopardise its flagship crime and disorder bill for the sake of this one single issue on the age of consent. And once the Lords did throw it back to the Commons with such a big majority last week, then this did become an issue that would the government drop it rather than see it overturned again in the Lords this week. And then, of course, the crime and disorder bill could indeed run out of time. That contains a number of manifesto pledges that the government wasn't going to let go. There were some early pledges and key manifesto points on young offenders particularly. The Labour government says it was largely elected on the law and order ticket, and it wasn't going to let that go by the board.
Now, I know they want to bring it back again. Are they going to be able to do that quickly? Is there any possibility at all that it might have to be ditched for good?
Well, it seems that the way that backbenchers and Anne Keane, the Labour MP who actually sponsored this amendment to bring down the age in the first place, it seems that they may well have been placated and they're prepared to accept it being dropped this time on the promise that it will be brought back in the next session, and therefore it could become law by early 1999. And it does seem likely that the government has offered some sort of promise along those lines that it could come back as a government bill, and therefore with government backing, with a minister speaking on its behalf, it would have more clout in the Houses of Parliament and get through that bit more quickly.
Christine Stewart, many thanks.
Foreign Office ministers have been cleared of responsibility for the arms to Sierra Leone affair. Instead, the report into the row has largely blamed civil servants. The report was investigating the export of weapons to Sierra Leone in breach of a United Nations arms embargo. The Foreign Secretary, Robin Cook, has promised big changes in his department in the wake of the inquiry.
Foreign Office officials are usually regarded as an elite, but today's report says they failed to brief ministers, they failed to understand both British law and the sensitivity of dealing with private military firms. But in Sierra Leone, they love the Foreign Office and chant the name of Peter Penfold, Britain's High Commissioner. He's a local hero for helping the country's president overthrow a military coup and return to power in February. Mr. Penfold, Britain's man on the spot, is heavily criticised by the inquiry for giving a degree of approval to an illegal shipment of arms to Sierra Leone. The report says the High Commissioner's meetings with Colonel Tim Spicer, head of Sandline, which supplied the illegal weapons, should have been reported to London more promptly and effectively. In the Commons, the Foreign Secretary accepted the findings, stressed ministers were cleared of any conspiracy, conceded they had not been fully briefed, but said officials would face no further action.
There will be no scapegoats, and this should be the end of the matter as far as individual officials are concerned. However, for the Foreign Office as an institution, the Legg report must provide the opening of a new chapter.
That new chapter, Mr. Cook said, will involve major management reforms to modernise Foreign Office methods, but the opposition want him to share the blame.
The picture painted by this report is of a Foreign Office in shambles. We already knew that ministers contradicted each other and themselves, that officials contradicted ministers and themselves. and that telegrams were lost and faxes destroyed. But the detailed evidence in this report is almost beyond belief.
After this report, Robin Cook is going to find a lot more papers to read in his famous red boxes. Ministers will be told much more and quicker after the changes he's promising. But critics say Mr Cook can't shake off all the blame for Peter Penfold's failings.
Mr Penfold's accused of acting without authority and with showing a lack of caution. But the real question is who was giving him the directions in a matter of foreign policy which was clearly of very considerable importance to the British government.
At the very least, Robin Cook is going to have to work hard if he's to get a firm grip on the Foreign Office and to repair a reputation for being a very accident-prone Foreign Secretary.